The Amazing Spider-Man is a pretty good movie, but not without its missteps. So once I decided that I would fix The Amazing Spider-Man 2, I thought I might as well fix this movie too. First, I gotta talk about the boundaries I'm setting. I'm keeping the same villain, not changing that. In fact, all the core concepts will stay the same. Unlike something like my Superman 3 rewrite, I'm gonna try to keep this as something that would actually be a rewrite rather than a reimagining, though this is still a pretty big rewrite by industry standards. I might change the order of some events structurally, but they're all there for the most part. The only major thing I'm changing is the finale. I know that's what he did in the comics, but the Lizard's plot to turn everyone in New York into lizard people is a little too comic book-esque. I know, it's a movie about a teenager with spider powers fighting a half-man, half-lizard creature. But the movie really aims to make that feel realistic so that it's different from the Sam Raimi movies, which really embraced its comic book roots. And it does that pretty well up until the finale. If I, as a big fan of comic book movies, find it jarring enough from the realistic tone of the rest of the movie that I feel my suspension of disbelief disappear, I think general audiences probably felt that way too. So I'm changing it. Also, I'm keeping the parent stuff. I know, but I can kind of respect the angle they went with adding some mystery around Peter's parents. I probably wouldn't do that if I was making a Spider-Man movie, but I get it. The main problem I'm going to be attempting to fix is a lack of consistency. This movie starts as a movie about a kid trying to find out what happened about his parents. Then, when Uncle Ben dies, there's an immediate shift, and now it's a movie about a kid with superpowers trying to avenge the death of his uncle. Then, once the lizard gets involved, it becomes a movie about a superhero trying to save the world. So, I want to fix that and make it all one movie. A movie about fatherhood. And to me, a Spider-Man origin movie should show Peter becoming more like Spider-Man every minute. In the original, Peter becomes Spider-Man like halfway through, but he shouldn't be Spider-Man until the end of Act 3. Alright, enough talk, let's get into it. So instead of opening with Peter as a kid, that scene of his parents leaving is going to be told through flashbacks throughout the film as it becomes relevant. We open at Peter's high school. I'm a firm believer that the first 10 minutes of a film should be dedicated to establishing the characters and world. We meet everybody, establish their relationships with each other, etc. At that 10-minute mark is when Peter finds his dad's briefcase and we get a flashback that's basically just Peter playing that hide-and-seek game and finding this briefcase under the couch before we cut back to reality. So then up in his room, Peter examines the briefcase and finds the secret compartment. Then we get a flashback continuing the previous one where we meet Peter's dad, and when he finds Peter with the briefcase and he curiously picks it up, opens the secret compartment and pulls out some papers. He looks at them before suddenly walking out of the room and up the stairs, Peter following his father before we cut back to the present. Peter searches through the compartment and finds the picture of Dr. Connors, some sheets of equations with notes in red pen, and a spider encased in amber. Yeah, I guess that's another big thing I'm changing. I hate there's a whole room of spiders that he finds in Oscorp. Having one spider is better, and having a spider that gives Peter powers come from his dad's briefcase gives it more of an air of mystery. He examines this amber, but then Uncle Ben tries to come in. Peter shoves the stuff under his bed, and the amber kind of skitters over to the other end of the room, where a stream of sunlight hits it. I know it's not super scientifically sound, but I think it works loosely considering it's a super spider in there, and it's barely still alive afterwards anyway. So Uncle Ben comes in and brings Peter down to watch wrestling with him. This is kind of what they bond over. So Peter goes back upstairs to work on school stuff, and the spider, now free because the amber has melted, bites him. Suddenly, Peter gets kind of delirious, and he hears a knock at the door and accidentally jumps up and sticks to the ceiling for a second before falling back down. Aunt May walks in and asks Peter what's happened and if he's okay, and says that dinner is ready, but Peter says that he isn't feeling well and would rather just sleep. So he wakes up the next morning and goes to school, where we get the basketball scene with Flash. But afterwards, when he's talking to Uncle Ben at school, that's when he really meets Gwen for the first time. We've seen her earlier in the movie, but she and Peter haven't talked until this point, and now they have plenty to talk about. They flirt a little and Peter goes home. So after that, Peter starts to like Gwen a little and wants to find a way to get closer to her, eventually finding out that she's an intern at Oscorp. He goes to Oscorp, but he can't get in the old-fashioned way, so he uses his powers to climb the building and get in through the window. I don't really have a huge problem with how he got inside in the original film, but I do think it was kind of mean-spirited, and this way he gets to start kind of getting used to his powers. So he spots Gwen, but before he gets over to her, he spots Dr. Connors, recognizing him from the picture in his dad's briefcase. He gets distracted and Gwen is gone by the time he looks back, so he ends up walking up to Dr. Connors, who kind of questions him, but Peter is able to make it seem like he belongs there with his smarts and tells Kurt that he is Richard and Mary Parker's son. And Dr. Connors is kind of shocked just thinking of his past with them, but then endeared, realizing he's talking to Peter Parker. They talk a little bit about his parents, and Connors reveals that he's working on biogenetic engineering to restore his arm by splicing his DNA with the lizards, and Peter is obviously enthralled by that because he got his powers from spider DNA. Peter also brings up the notes he found in his dad's briefcase. Kurt says that some of the research they did involved work with spiders, and that his mom was apparently working on a side project using some of that research to try and create a really strong polymer designed to emulate spider webs, and that she could never quite crack it, and that he couldn't either when Mary asked him to look at it. Peter would love to keep talking to him, but he has to get home, so he gets Dr. Connors' business card and leaves. I think that it works better for the story if after this is when Peter has his first date with Gwen, and that's what makes him miss picking up Aunt May. Though his first date with Gwen isn't dinner at her house, because that's still something that happens later in the movie. So, after that, the whole Uncle Ben's death thing is pretty much identical to how it is in the original movie, though I'm gonna sort of change Peter's reaction to it. In the original, Peter goes on a spree of trying to avenge Uncle Ben's death and just kind of stumbles into being Spider-Man. Not gonna happen, at least not like that. In this version, Peter does have that initial instinct to hunt down Uncle Ben's killer, so he puts on this wrestling mask that Uncle Ben made him so that he covers his face, and he runs out into the night. In a fit of rage, he keeps running down alleyways trying to find Uncle Ben's killer, but eventually he starts hearing someone yelling for help, that someone's attacking them, so he rushes off. He finds himself at a drugstore confronting a robber. He heroically stops the robber with his powers, but as soon as he sees there's no star tattoo on his wrist, he leaves. He wasn't there to be a hero. He was there to try and avenge his uncle. But that act is what will make him a hero. The next day, we get that montage at the beginning of Peter depressed at school. So then after that, we get a scene where Peter and May are having dinner for the first time without Uncle Ben. It's kind of awkward and sad without him, but they bond a little. They decide to turn on the TV when a newscast from the Daily Bugle shows up. This doesn't have to be J. Jonah Jameson, though it'd be nice if it was. Basically, the newscast talks about reports about a man with spider powers saving a drugstore from an armed robbery. They're calling him Spider-Man. Suddenly, Uncle Ben's words that with great power comes great responsibility, or at least the version of this movie, ring in his head a little bit. This is his first step to becoming Spider-Man. Peter and May talk a little bit about this news headline. Aunt May kind of jokingly brings up the idea of, oh, well, if he has spider powers, does this mean he can spin webs? And Peter says that that's ridiculous, though May says that it sounds like it could be useful, and that's not too out of left field. Suddenly, Peter gets an idea and rushes upstairs where he cracks his mom's formula overnight and builds the web shooters. So he goes out and stops some crimes the next night, running into Captain Stacy along the way and just barely getting away, with Captain Stacy's impression being that he's a criminal, or at least some kind of jerk. The next day, Gwen sets up the dinner date for that night, but before the date, he's at home when Dr. Connors shows up at the Parker house. He's basically there to give his condolences because he's heard about Uncle Ben and to apologize for not staying in the life of the Parkers after Richard and Mary died. So then that night, surprise, surprise, when he meets Captain Stacy at Gwen's house. Everything goes pretty smoothly until Mrs. Stacy turns on the news and they're talking about Spider-Man. mostly talking about how amazing this guy is and how he's kind of a show-off, and they're surprised he's not wearing some big colorful costume with the mask, and that whole thing kind of prompts that fight about Spider-Man and the morality of him. But that also gives Peter a little more of a reason to make that costume. Spider-Man has never really had a good reason for having the costume he does, but that makes it a little bit more relevant. So the next day, Peter meets with Dr. Connors, and you can really tell they're bonding. Clearly, Peter sees Dr. Connors as his new father figure, and Dr. Connors sees Peter as a son figure. Also, I think we saw in one or two scenes that Dr. Connors had a kid or two in the original, so I think it's safe to say in this version, Dr. Connors does not have any kids. So, like in the original, Peter helps Dr. Connors to create his formula. I think a cool way to go about it is if Connors kind of brings up Spider-Man, and they use him as a basis for their theory, with Connors theorizing that Spider-Man is a product of genetic engineering, and Peter quote-unquote inferring clues about how his powers work. Also, I think it'd be nice if we actually have a scene with Gwen, Peter, and Dr. Connors together, considering the only time that happens in the original version is when Peter first meets Dr. Connors, and that scene isn't this version. So when Dr. Connors refuses to let Oscorp commence with human trials, Rotha fires Dr. Connors, and it actually has consequences in this version, unlike how he's fired in the actual movie, but just kind of keeps working at Oscorp anyway. So Connors is fired and is sitting at his home lab, which is sort of like a garage away from the rest of the house, because obviously he doesn't want anything to go wrong and affect his house. But anyway, he's there, and he looks at that day's Daily Bugle. It's a front page article about Spider-Man, hero of the city. He thinks about how this man became a hero likely by using science to create cross-species genetics in a way that Dr. Connors had been researching for years. And he's determined that he won't let Oscorp use his research to hurt people. So he whips up the formula at home, determined to make sure it's safe by testing it on himself. And that's when he becomes the Lizard. This next part is pretty similar to what we got in the original, just in a slightly different context. The Lizard goes to the bridge to stop Rotha, and Spider-Man swings by. So in the original movie, you sometimes see Spider-Man and think, Jesus, I know he's supposed to be quippy, but he's kind of an ass. Well, that's actually kind of perfect right now. You see him being a jerk to that thief, and then he gets chased by the police to the bridge. He fights the Lizard, saves the kid, becoming a little more like Spider-Man, and he saves Dr. Rotha as well. So something that's weird about the original movie is that there's this big concern that Dr. Rotha is going to give the formula to the patients, so the Lizard goes to try and stop him. But Spider-Man saves him, and then nothing else happens with him in the movie. They explicitly say that he's alive, but the fact that he's giving this formula to these patients is never addressed. I'm guessing he probably died in a deleted scene or something, but anyways, that will come up later. So then Peter goes to Gwen's house after being trashed by the Lizard, and you can kind of tell that he's really becoming Spider-Man, because Gwen's asking him why he would do something like this, and he's telling her that it kind of started as an ego trip, but that he's starting to do it for the feeling that comes with helping people. So the next day we see Dr. Connors sitting in his home, and I kind of wish he and the Lizard were a little more like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So he's sitting there kind of feeling sick, just thinking about the people he hurt, but the Lizard is in his head influencing his thoughts, telling him that it was all payback to everyone who's ever made fun of him or treated him lesser because of his disability, kind of twisting his deeply rooted thoughts into evil ones. So after school, Peter goes to Oscorp to meet with Dr. Connors, but when he gets to his office, it's just a wreck. Papers all over the floor. Clearly it's been raided by Oscorp to get the formula. This gives Peter a flashback to him as a kid, following his dad up the stairs and seeing his dad walk into his home office and discovering it's been raided. So, he asks around and finds out that Dr. Connors was fired. So on his way over to Dr. Connors' house, we cut to Dr. Connors and the Lizard fighting over how to deal with the fact that Rotha is still alive, and eventually the Lizard wins out and Dr. Connors transforms into the Lizard. So the Lizard runs to find Dr. Rotha, sort of trashing Dr. Connors' office in the process. So Peter is walking down the street and hears something, so he runs to Kurt's house, and his wife says that there was rustling in Kurt's lab and now he's gone. Peter goes to the lab and sees it's trashed, with claw marks everywhere, and immediately thinks that the Lizard has taken Dr. Connors. So he gets on his Spidey suit and goes on the hunt for the Lizard. Eventually he finds the Lizard in the sewer, but instead of Dr. Connors, he has Dr. Rotha captured. So at first Peter is just kind of sleuthing in the background, and the Lizard is able to pull out of Rotha that the formula has already been delivered delivered to the hospital and that trials begin in a couple days. In the Lizard's mind, Dr. Connors is telling him to tell Dr. Rother to stop the experiments, but the Lizard instead just lets him go and tells him not to tell anyone about this. So Spider-Man kind of reveals himself, and he fights the Lizard, asking where Dr. Connors is. This is when the Lizard reveals he is Dr. Connors, and Spider-Man tries to stop him, but the Lizard keeps alluding to the idea that Spider-Man should join him, and that together they could rule the world, but Spidey just escapes. So after this, he transforms back into Dr. Connors, and he asks the Lizard why he didn't make Rotha stop the human trials. The Lizard essentially tells Kurt that the humans are weak. They've done nothing but neglect them, but now they are the next evolution, the new master race of Earth, and that the humans will fall. The Lizard has taken Dr. Connors' thoughts that he isn't less than others because of his disability and twisted it into the idea that now, because of the formula, they are superior to all humans, that they would rule, ideally with Spider-Man by their side. So the next day, we have that scene where Peter goes to the NYPD and tells Captain Stacy about Dr. Connors. But instead of Captain Stacy actually asking the NYPD to look into Dr. Connors, since he knows him from his daughter working for him, he just goes to Kurt's house and talks to him a little bit. At the end, he's a little bit suspicious still, but Dr. Connors has pretty much convinced him that everything's fine. So Captain Stacy leaves, but then we have another scene with Dr. Connors and the Lizard, where the Lizard tells Kurt that Peter is Spider-Man. This is kind of surprising to Dr. Connors, but the Lizard basically explains how it all fits together with their old research with Oscorp and how much Peter knows about Spider-Man. I think the Lizard, like with a lot of his ideas, picked up some subconscious thoughts that Kurt had when he figures this out. But I also think he does it because even though he's not sure that it's true, he wants Dr. Connors to be more up for the Lizard's plan to team up with Spider-Man to rule the world, given Dr. Connors' relationship with Peter. But the Lizard goes on about how they have to, quote-unquote, persuade Peter to join them. So the next day is when we get the scene of the Lizard attacking the school, but it's under a new context of him doing it to kidnap Gwen. So the Lizard gets away with Gwen, telling Peter that together they can rule over the Earth as a race of genetically enhanced superhumans if they join forces. Obviously Peter refuses, but the Lizard says that he'll have Gwen at Oscorp Tower in the meantime. And this is also when the full scope of the Lizard's plan is revealed. Peter asks him how they'll take over the world with just the two of them. But then the Lizard says it won't just be the two of them. That night, Oscorp tests out their brand new healing formula on hospital patients, and all of them will become lizard people. With that small army, they could easily take over the world and dominate all of mankind. The Lizard in this version doesn't want all humans to become lizards. He wants the lizards to dominate the humans. If Peter tries to stop the test from happening at the hospital, the Lizard will kill Gwen. But if Peter joins him and lets the test go on, he'll let Gwen go and she'll be spared in the takeover. So this is when Peter's at his lowest low of the movie. Despite him doing his best to be this hero, he failed. His mentor and father figure has become a monster, his girlfriend is in danger, and because the police still doesn't trust him, he's in a situation where he can't win. So he just sits alone in his room, mourning an inevitable loss. I know Peter doesn't listen to Uncle Ben's voicemail until the end of the movie, but in this version, I think now's a good time. And in this version, it goes a little something like this. Hey, Peter, look, I'm sorry. I know I told you that with great power, there must also come great responsibility. And don't get me wrong, that's true. But I think I was a little too hard on you. Look, you're just a kid. You have your whole life ahead of you, and right now you have a lot on your plate. You have school, worrying about colleges, work, photography, science, and now it seems like you're taking an interest in that girl Gwen. It's okay for you to make mistakes. Let me tell you a secret about being an adult. There is none. There's nothing that just makes you an adult. You've gone through more already with your parents than a lot of people I know have gone through their whole lives. You're a teenager. Go do teenage things. Make mistakes. Learn from them. Grow. And be with people that help you do those things. You seem to really have grown connections with Gwen and Dr. Connors, and that's great. Pursue them. Because, sure, With great power comes great responsibility. But at the end of the day, you don't owe anybody anything except for yourself. Alright, I've gone on long enough. I'll see you soon. Bye. And Peter sits there, tears streaming down his face, before he puts on his mask and webs out of his room. He has lives to save, because while a lot of people think that Spider-Man is Spider-Man because he lives by the fact that with great power comes great responsibility, that's not true. Spider-Man is Spider-Man because he knows that he doesn't owe them anything. And he helps people anyway. He webs through the city, super triumphant until he gets cornered by the NYPD. This is the big scene where he reveals himself to Captain Stacy and finally gets him on his side. On his way to Oscorp Tower, he suddenly hears someone screaming for help, so he takes a quick detour to see someone being mugged. So he goes down there, and after fighting off the mugger just enough to save the citizen, he looks at the mugger and recognizes him. It's Uncle Ben's killer. Part of Peter wants to drop everything and just beat the living hell out of this guy. But he doesn't. He webs away to Oscorp because he's not the vengeful person we saw earlier in the film. He's Spider-Man. So he gets to Oscorp Tower, and at first the Lizard thinks Peter's there to join them. But no, Peter says. He's just there on a pit stop to beat him up and help Gwen before he saves the people at the hospital. He and the Lizard fight for a bit before Captain Stacy shows up and joins him, shooting the Lizard as a distraction so Peter is able to grab Gwen and web her over to the hospital. There he grabs the formula before they can distribute it, but before he makes off with it, the Lizard, who's pretty much taken Captain Stacy out, has come and starts fighting Peter over the formula. Peter starts calling out to Curt Connors. He knows is still in there, and after a while it works just enough that Connors is able to force the Lizard to throw the formula on the ground and jump off the building. The formula's glass container shatters and the formula just evaporates into the air. Meanwhile, the Lizard is impaled on a short skyscraper below. Similar to, get this, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as the Lizard is seemingly dying, he transforms back into Dr. Connors. Peter jumps down onto the building and pulls Dr. Connors off, and they talk a little bit with Dr. Connors apologizing, and Peter drops him off at the hospital. So Peter heads back over to Oscorp, where Captain Stacy dies in his arms, with them establishing a father-like bond in his dying moments to the point where Peter is having flashbacks to seeing his parents for the last time. So fast forward to a couple days later. Everyone's at Captain Stacy's funeral, but Peter's at the hospital visiting Dr. Connors instead. Dr. Connors says he'll be alright and that they're treating the remainder of the formula in his system. They bond a little more and they see on TV that since the police have announced that they no longer hate Spider-Man, the Daily Bugle, which was once pro-Spider-Man and anti-police, now thinks Spider-Man is, well, a menace. So after that, we get the final scene with Peter and Gwen and we roll credits. But of course now Peter has changed. Throughout this whole movie, he's been chasing a father figure. But now he's his own man. So the mid-credits sequence changes a little too. Now it's in the hospital with Dr. Connors being alright, but as soon as the nurses leave, the lights go out and Gustav Fiers arrives. Also, to add a little more menace to the character, when he leaves, he unplugs Dr. Connors' machinery. The nurses rush in, and once the lights are back on, they're too late. Dr. Connors is dead. So, what did you guys think of this? It took me a long time, but it's finally done. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.